Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Thursday of week 10. I guess this is our last lecture for the term. Super exciting to, I guess, wrap it all up. I'm sure many of you are. T3's always got that hint of exhaustion, right? That most of you are just, very tired, essentially, at this point of the year. Thankfully today, though, we have a relatively relaxed time. Most of what we're going to be talking about today is the final exam and some details about the final exam. And then we're also going to be talking about, if we have time, we'll be talking about a little bit of a bonus thing just around prototyping, essentially. Now, there was a lecture yesterday. That was a guest lecture about Python. You didn't have to go to that. That was just in the timetable. You can go and, I'm not sure if the recording's been up yet. I didn't manage that lecture. The recording is up, so you can go watch it there. It's just a YouTube video link. But today we're going to be talking about the final exam. Now, thankfully, the final exam is a relatively straightforward thing to talk about because all of the information is just sitting here on this exam page. Normally I would go through this a little bit quickly in latter year courses, but because for a handful of you, this is going to be the first time that you've kind of dealt with an exam, I guess, in a course I administer, because most of them are pretty the same. I'll really take a step through it slowly. So the very first things to chat about are the requirements for you to sit the exam. So forget for a second what's in the exam, when the exam is, or anything like that. It's about whether or not you should be doing the exam on the given day, basically due to either illness or other kind of circumstance. So one thing that we do expect from all students is that when you sit the exam, you are doing so whilst you have a stable internet connection. So if you don't have a stable internet connection at home, that could be for a number of reasons. Maybe you have poor reception, maybe there's issues with your internet for a couple of weeks, maybe your family uses a lot of internet at certain times a day. It's your responsibility to get access to a stable internet connection. So if you know before the exam your internet's not great, you should sort that out before the exam, or you should apply for special consideration to change that in some way. A lot of the time this is very manageable though, because particularly now with lockdowns eased, it's very easy to go to, in some cases to like a relative's house, or to go somewhere where you have decent like mobile hotspot reception, because it's just a 3-hour exam. And realistically, all you need is enough reception to connect to VLab or connect to terminal via VS Code, and to pull from GitLab. It's very light on the internet requirements, and I think most people will be fine. I think the only times people might want to be cautious are if you are using VLab and you feel like your internet isn't very good. Most people in Australia that have NBN of any sort will be absolutely fine, because VLab is not that resource intensive in terms of bandwidth. But that's an important place to start. Now, I mentioned to you before that this is what you do if you know you have internet issues prior to the exam starting. The reason I say the prior thing is because this exam, like all other exams at UNSW, is covered by fit to sit policy, and that means that if you start the exam, you are saying that all issues you have prior to that exam to do with your health or extenuating circumstances, you deem that they're all okay and you're okay to go. And what I mean by that is, as an example, this exam's on a Friday. If you wake up on a Thursday morning and you have this terrible migraine, and you have a migraine all day, and then you wake up on the Friday and it's a little better, but it's still pretty bad, and then you start the exam, you can't kind of stop the exam at that point. Like, you can't say, I was too sick for the exam and I was sick before the exam, right? So all of the kind of issues that let you kind of sit a sup after the exam started only apply for issues that come up during your exam. So for instance, if you start the exam in perfect health and then randomly your dog starts throwing up and you have to rush them to the vet, or you have a sibling in the house who passed out, or something crazy happens during the exam, that's when you can apply for special consideration during the exam. But for anything that you are aware is or could be an issue prior to the exam, that doesn't count. And this is really, really important because it comes up every term. Someone says, oh, I felt really sick yesterday and I still feel sick today and I'm an hour into the exam and I don't want to finish it now. The reason this rule exists is relatively simple. It's to stop people using a pre-existing issue as a kind of just in case. You know what I mean? Like, I feel sick, I'll start the exam, and if it's too hard, then I'll just say I'm sick. And that way I kind of get the best of both worlds. I can try and do it now, and if I don't like the exam, I can say I'm sick and go do it later. So that's what that's trying to get around. If you do have any issues during the exam, and one of you statistically will have an issue at least, you can stop the exam, email me, CS1531. Just explain clearly what's happening. You can also post on the forum if you want, and then immediately submit a special consideration request, because if you do have to stop the exam, you know, I need some kind of something in writing, right? So you don't stop the exam at, say, 3 p.m. and then email me at 8 p.m. and say, oh, I had to stop the exam. It's like the very first thing you do, obviously, assuming it's not an emergency, is you email me, right? So let's say you develop a serious physical condition during the exam, or you just stop the exam, shoot me a quick email. It can even be I'm stopping the exam, we'll email later. Something like that's totally fine. You can apply for special consideration, and of course, in all of those cases, if the issue you're dealing with is severe, naturally you should sort out the issue before emailing me or applying for special consideration. You know, such as your roof collapsed on your head and now you're bleeding everywhere, right? Like, there's 100 different things that could happen. So that's all just like deciding on the day, should you sit this exam or not. In terms of the date, time of the exam, it's all relatively simple, and we got lucky with the time this term, which is good. The exam's a 3-hour exam, so it just runs for 3 hours. It's not an all-day exam, nothing crazy like that. And it runs between 2 p.m. and 5 p.m. Sydney time. And in fact, I have to change this time because it says Australian Eastern Standard Time. But in actual fact, it's daylight saving time in Sydney now. So whatever Sydney time is, right? Like right now it's 9:14 a.m. in Sydney. That's the time zone. It's most of you are in Sydney and a whole bunch of you are in Indonesia. Now, for those students who are in parts of Indonesia, you will be sitting the exam at the same time as everyone else, but it'll be earlier in the day. This is the benefit of afternoon exams, is that we'll have a whole bunch of students from China or other parts of Asia who'll be sitting the exam from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. your time, because I think China's 3 hours behind at the moment. If you're a student outside of that Asia Pacific region, in particular if you're in the Americas or you're in Europe or I guess Middle East, Africa, or anything like that, which I think very, very few of you are, then you can email me and we'll sort out an alternative time. Though as far as I understand it, I think about 85% of you are based in Australia right now or something, and the rest of you are mostly based in China or India, from what I understand. So there's a good chance that one or two or maybe no people are kind of in this bucket. If you do have ELS requirements, if you do have equitable learning requirements, as in extra time in the exam or something else like that, then you can, you don't have to do anything right now, because I have a list of all of who you are, and I'll be reaching out to you later this week, probably over the weekend, or most realistically early next week, where I will just confirm for you explicitly that this is the information I have about your circumstances and what time your exam starts and exam ends. So if you're in that bucket, you don't have to worry. You'll be getting an email from me. And if you don't have that email, obviously, by the middle of next week, then someone higher up in UNSW might have made a mistake. And we can easily sort all of these things out. So please don't stress about any of that. We always make these things work. We only count submissions you make during your exam time window for your final exam, obviously. Now, the more interesting part, which is exam structure, which is probably what you're all curious about, is that your exam will be worth 100 marks, and those 100 marks will make up 35% of the course, because your course is worth the exam's worth 35%, right? Now, the exam will be mostly broken up into two categories. The first one will be short answer questions, and the second one will be programming questions. Now, the specific ratio of these two things kind of varies a bit because we're still finalizing the exam, but it's generally like, 15 to 25% short answers, 75 to 85% programming questions. Now, the short answers are going to be very similar to some of the tutorial and lab questions where we ask you to justify or explain something. They're all going to be short written responses, typically worth 2 to 4 marks, but like I'd say 2 to 2.5 marks is the average. And there's going to be no diagrams. It's all typing. It's all like, like a question will ask is explain this and you'll write a sentence or two. Or we'll say explain and contrast this and you'll write maybe 1, 2, or 3 sentences like that. The purpose of the short answer questions is that we don't want this to be fully an exam on Python. Right now, it's very difficult to ask short answer questions because of the tendency to which they're plagiarized, and it can sometimes have an impact on people with poor English skills, which can feel a little bit unfair. Ideally, in a perfect world, we'd ask you all short answer questions for this course, right? It's a course on software engineering and software engineering principles. It's not a Python course. So ideally, that's what we would be doing. There's kind of insurmountable challenges to do with that. So we do have a relatively kind of focused Python exam. And to make up for that, we try and make the project a little bit less more fluffy and less auto-marky. We try and have these other components in there to compensate for that. Because I guess normally you might have the course be a lot more Python-y and the exam a lot less Python-y, but that's okay. Now, the second part, the programming questions, are all very similar to, are all very similar to, what would you say, like all of your lab and tutorial questions and everything else, in the sense that there's a small problem, go and solve it. In fact, the sample exam that I've given you actually includes, of the programming questions, 2 lab questions in an exam style format, so you can see what that is. And in terms of those sample exam questions, and we will look through the sample exam, it's going to be essentially, here's a programming question, solve it, as in implement it, write some tests for it, and then we will expect you to, we'll mark you basically on implementation, testing, and coverage. So it's a little bit like the project in terms of, your testing, implementation, and coverage matter, but Pylint doesn't. We don't do any Pylint testing in the final exam, and we also, all the questions in the final exam can be completed with all of the modules available in like the course-wide requirements.txt as well. Some of the questions may be on HTTP-based questions, as in you do have to be familiar with Flask. Part of the reason we do actually also kind of do things like this is so that we can make sure that all the students in the course met certain learning outcomes, because statistically, again, there are some of you here who did get your friends to look at to actually do parts of the huge parts of the project for you, and we want to make sure that everyone kind of has a somewhat baseline understanding of how that all goes. There is no hurdle for the final exam, so there will be a number of students, I don't know how many, there's probably like 10 or 20% of students who will already pass the course by the final exam, because you've obviously you are soon to have been awarded 65% of the final marks of the course by the exam. So there will be students who pass the course by the exam. That also means that for at least half of you, you probably won't have to pass the exam to pass the course. I don't know the specific statistics, but that's likely. And all the programming questions we give you will have a basic sample input and output. They'll contain a basic PyTest for you to sanity check your work. However, you'll either be required to write your own tests or encouraged to write your own tests. Cool. So, answering some questions. Waleed says, is the exam the place students lose the majority of marks in 1531, or is that the project? I mean, it depends on the student, but what I would say is that, on average, because some students actually lose the most marks in labs, and some other students lose the most marks in the project, but on average, what you would find is that the average mark for the labs is relatively high. the average mark for the projects is lower than that, and the average mark for the final exam is lower than that. So yes, on average, there's going to be a lower average for the final exam, naturally. And I'll just follow on from this. I've heard some 1531 questions are quite hard. Are we to expect some super hard questions like 1511 in the final exam, or are they all doable? Well, that's a great question. I don't think so much that. Well, I'm not a fan of writing undoable exam questions. You know, the way I describe this to people is that I always like to write an exam where, you know, one student gets 100%, theoretically. Because what that means is that we made it just hard enough for the absolute best student in the course to get it all out. And if we don't have a student getting 100%, then I feel like we made it too hard. And if we have many students getting 100%, I feel like we made it too easy. And again, because the whole point of all assessment is to help understand the spread of students that exist in the course. And I'll keep reiterating again, the benefit of a spread is that it's very easy to unspread a spread. It's very hard to spread out an unspread, right? So it's like if we do find, for instance, that we think, oh, wow, that was actually harder than we thought, then sometimes in the past we do adjust spreads and stuff in a way that's beneficial for the student. So I keep kind of getting these questions about, is the difficulty similar to 2521 last term? That's a really hard question to answer because the kind of types of problems are very different. The programming language is very different. What students tend to find easy and hard is very different. Though generally I would say for students who've done 2521 with me in the past that we approach the exam the same way is what I'd say. Like, I don't really know how to compare the difficulty, but the same kind of principles that inform us exist. So, and again, it's hard to say because someone would find a 153. Like, I've met students who find 1531 super easy and 2521 really hard, right? So it's very hard to just kind of compare things. But back to the question about, will there be questions that are, not doable? No, there's no questions that we would expect that everyone can't do, is the short answer. Of course, there'll be questions we expect that many of you can't do. And there'll be questions that we think that many of you could do if you had more time, but you won't because you'll be kind of, you aren't as comfortable with other questions. That's all part of the exam. But no, there's absolutely nothing in the design of this that's this question is not doable, ha 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 ha. If we have we have as much difficulty in the exam as we think we need to adequately assess you, and to provide a broad enough array of challenges to be able to, not have everyone fall into the same bucket. There's no point having 3 questions that everyone answers easily and 2 questions that no one can answer, right? Waleed said that I mentioned in 2521 when I taught that course that the average student will be able to look at every question and have a general idea on how to do it. Yeah, that's true. That would be the true same thing for here. Sometimes we do have a small question at the end that is a bit harder that we know some students can do, and most students will be like, I have no idea how to do that. We tried that out one term, and it was a really small question at the end. We're still finalizing the exam, but broadly speaking, there's nothing crazy that's this is meant to be super impossible or anything like that. The reason I'll tell you, the reason that we actually don't need that is because your exam performance is going to be less good than you expect. And this isn't because you're all stupider than you think or something. It's actually because programming in an exam is hard because you will make mistakes and not realize it, right? That's kind of the nature of it. You will complete questions and you'll think you did it right, but you didn't, basically. This doesn't happen as much in the project because you have time to think about it and go back to it and your group members look at it. So, we see a lot of students kind of coming out of the exam thinking they got 90%, but they actually got 60%. And then they feel like something went wrong, and whatnot. And it's no, it's just you overestimated the degree to which you had everything right, which is super normal in a time pressure exam. But so did everyone else, right? It's not like everyone's up there scoring 90s. I don't know the numbers from the previous terms, but it's pretty standard to have an average exam mark of 50 out of 100, I'm pretty sure like if you're the average student, you'll get that. And that's not to say that you only did half the questions or anything crazy. That's actually like we find the average student would answer, say, 90% of the questions plus, but they would just get some wrong and they'd make some mistakes in some and so forth, right? And we try and spread things out too that, no one gets tanked by a single problem. To some other questions that have been asked, Justin says, how about a different language test for non-native speakers? I don't know if that's an actual question. It's hard to tell sometimes because I could understand that as a very serious question or a bit of fun. But it's like, in terms of why we wouldn't do that, it just gets very... The problem is that like UNSW has a policy that you have to have a certain level of English to do your assessments. And that's why all assessments are in English. I think there's always some occasional tension to say that occasionally the bar should be higher. I don't really know what the rules or anything around that are. I just know that asking some questions that require some clear-cut English-based communication can feel like it's a little bit punishing to people who, don't have a stronger grip on the language. That being said, that's a bigger issue with level 6 courses, and level 9 courses with postgrads, I think, more than undergrads, but it's not really a big deal. We just don't like... The other reason we don't ask too many short answer questions is because it's expensive to mark and it takes a long time, frankly. Marking one short answer question would take someone maybe 4 hours to do. So then if you have... And we'll probably have like 8 short answer questions. So now that's 32 hours. And if you had a whole exam of that, now you're looking at suddenly like 150 hours of marking to get done in like a week across some handful of tutors. So there is just some practical realities that I have to work to. David says, are they of the same difficulty, all the questions? No, they will be of different difficulties, and that's a good thing because like we don't want to have all medium questions because that just means that all of the really good students finish them all and all of the really poor students struggle with everything. There'll certainly be like some questions that are a little bit easier and a little bit harder. Also, it's very hard to gauge difficulty because, if you look at the sample exam, you'll see some questions were using the date-time library and some questions were doing data manipulation. And people find those two things easy or hard depending on their own kind of experience and confidence levels. So it's very hard to kind of gauge difficulty, for instance. And then the other question David said was, is it open book or are we allowed to search on the internet to look at past labs? I will cover that in the communication and help during the exam part. Now, in terms of Blake's question, because Blake has a question... Oh, sorry, I'll answer Diaurora's first. Says, if the exam's going to be done over SSH or VLab, how will we manage port numbers for the Flask questions? That's a good question. You basically can just use any port that works if you get a Flask question over SSH or VLab. And when we mark your exam, we have ways where we can force your port to be a certain port. So... but anyway, something like this will be clearly instructed in the exam anyway. So, you'll be able to use any port you want. Most likely in the exam question you'll actually be given like a config.py file or something where you can adjust the port there so that we can just replace that file when we mark it. But the point is that will be a solved problem. And then Blake says, will people look at our code? That's an excellent question. This question always comes up every term. The short answer is that we look at code when we feel like something terrible has happened, because I describe this, and I know a few of you have had an exam with me before, but like the nature of the exam is that like you'll write some code and it might not work. And that's just like a part of the assessment, right? Like if you write code that's 90% there and it doesn't work and one of the questions gets a 0 for that, that's just like part of the assessment. In reality, code needs to work. It's a reasonable kind of learning outcome to expect. What we don't want to do, however, is we don't want someone who makes a mistake. We want someone who makes a mistake to have this kind of logical mark response to it that's just like it is what it is. But if people make many mistakes, or if people make some to many mistakes that cause them to fail, we don't want to punish students for that, because that's a bit mean, So what that means is that basically, when we mark your exam, we go and we go and look at two specific cases. One are students who get very low exam marks, and by low, I don't have a specific number for you, but let's say that their short answer questions look reasonable and their programming marks are like 10% or something, 10 or 20%. And we also notice that their programming marks are all like 0 out of 5, 0 out of 10, 0 out of 12, as opposed to like, 6 out of 12, 5 out of 12. You know what I mean? Like, it's very clear that they've basically gotten 0 in a question. So I'm not trying to turn it into an algorithm, because it's not, because it's a lot softer than that, because we have to be very case by case. But it's basically like, to write it in a bit of logic. If you have, if you have many questions that are 0 out of x, where x is the number of marks, then we will manually check. Else if you fail the course, we will manually check. Else, it's just the auto marking is the short answer. So the reason for this is relatively simple. Again, I would love to be able to manually mark all of your work, but UNSW's timetable to return marks, as well as, limitations we have on, budgeting and stuff, to manually mark all of your exam questions would, we're talking about thousands of exam questions, right? So it's just not feasible. And also, how do you fairly manually mark people? Someone's like, oh, well, I just had I had an indent wrong. It's like, okay, sure, well, that's fair enough. That's a simple mistake. And then someone says, oh, yeah, I just had an undefined variable. And it's like, well, that's a little bit less of an excuse. And then someone's like, yeah, I actually just forgot to paste this one line of code in. And you know what I mean? And it gets very hard, because then it's like, well, how do we assess what's fair and what's not? And it gets very messy. So in a lot of ways, for kind of fairness, it's just like, here are the rules. We mark you based on those rules. We mark fairly based on those rules. And some of you will make some mistakes. A lot of you will make tiny mistakes that have an impact on a question. And that's, again, part of the process. However, we don't want people to tank the exam because of something random that's happened, where they get 0 out of a lot in all the questions. And we don't want you to fail the course. So particularly people that fail the course, this one is the biggest thing, because, you getting a lower mark than you expect, you will move on with your life and you'll just have a different number on a transcript, right? Even though it's, your fault, so to speak, it's like you can still get on with your life. Some people will fail the course because of the exam, which, again, is their fault, for lack of a better phrase, but it's a bit penal because of how important 1531 is in your program. So when we go and manually look at your exam, we basically look at it and say, did this student clearly get it? There was just a couple little things that ruined it for them. Or are we like, no, they just don't really have the knowledge. And 3 times out of 4 people who fail the course and we manually check their exam, nothing changes, because most of the time people who fail the course just actually don't know enough to pass the course, and that's totally okay. That happens every term. I don't know how many people, typically, the typical fail rate at UNSW, I think, is between 10 and 20% for a course or something crazy. I think it might be 10 for first. I can't remember what the number is, but it's something like that. Call it 10% for fun. That's just kind of part of the life of this. So that's kind of wrap up Blake's question. Will people look at our code? If in some circumstances, yes. We don't mind your mistakes giving you little slaps here and there. That's part of assessment, but we don't want anyone's life to be just totally wrecked from it or anything like that. We don't want people to lose on a technicality. That's what I keep saying to people, right? So you don't want a student who just used the wrong version of Python to fail the course, even though all their code works fine. Maximilian says, will our test cases be manually marked, or is it sufficient to just have 100% coverage with them? We don't manually mark any of your code. It's all auto-marked. I've seen some questions about the exam repo and sample exam stuff. I'm going to go and have a look at that tonight. So that'll all be fine. The whole solutions thing, I'll go and double check all of that. I think someone's already posted about it. Okay. And then Diorora says, will there be Git repo management questions in the exam? We might have short answer questions about that kind of thing. Like, why is git add dash dash all something to be cautious of? Or, what's the difference between these two commands or something? But to be honest with you, in the exam, we often ask questions, particularly for short answer, and you'll see this in the sample exam, that we consider to be hard to plagiarize, because we're not interested in saying, what's the answer to this question when that's something you can Google. What we're interested in is asking you a question that's like, explain this or justify this. And we'll see that when we look at the sample exam. So a lot of the time, while you can understand the theory by looking it up on the internet, you'll actually have to kind of express your, a clear critical understanding of it, a little bit like high school. So platform to complete the exam. We're going to distribute the exam via GitLab. The final exam will be the same as the sample exam. You'll get a spec, you'll have a personal repo, you clone the personal repo, you work on it, you push the personal repo. We mark that repo. There is no submit button or anything like that. The exam can be completed locally or via VLab. When we say VLab, we mean CSE machines. That can be VS Code, SSH. And regardless of where you complete the exam, you must push your work to your GitLab master branch, and you must ensure that your code works in the VLab environment. Now, I get this question again. People say, oh God, I haven't tested much in VLab this term. It's like, when we say VLab again, we mean just like the CSE machines, though you want to check your Flask stuff with the VLab, with VLab probably. There is nothing different about the final exam compared to throughout the course. So like, don't stress about this. If you have, for instance, had a perfectly fine term and you've written lots of code and you've run stuff locally and it hasn't worked, you're probably going to be fine in the final exam. We still will ask you to check it in VLab, but you don't need to like stress that something terrible is going to happen. There may be a question about Flask, so you do need access to some kind of API client like ARC or Postman. I don't think that's strictly necessary. Like we say, you must have it, but it's like you could test these things manually by writing, Python code to test things, but it should be enough to have an API client. We're just kind of letting you know that in advance. And these are the two requirements.txt files that we will have, that we will assume that, you can assume that we will have installed when we run your code. Technical issues relating to your local environment are not grounds for special consideration. Thankfully, by this point, any of you who kind of work locally will not really have any problems because you probably nutted them all out by now. And then do not leave it to the deadline to push your code to master. Yeah, so what happens is that your exam runs from 2 to 5, and at 5 p.m., we cut your exam access. You can't access it on GitLab. You can't get pushed to it, right? You lose access to it. We actually we make you not a member of your repo anymore, right? It's not like the projects where we just say there's a deadline. We actually cut your access from it. So whatever you've pushed by 5 is what you have. So please make sure you push by 5. Now, CSE are notorious for not resourcing GitLab efficiently, which means that, often during exams we have, particularly with 1531, we have had like issues with outages and slowness before. If you have any issues during the exam where you say try and push and you get a 500 error or something that looks like GitLab is down, take a breath, because if GitLab's down, you're all going to get a few extra minutes to submit. Don't worry. Just wait 10, 20, 30 seconds and try and push again. The problem is, of course, when GitLab goes down, everyone starts spamming the terminal, which makes it even worse, right? So it's like 700 people try and push in a minute, it all fails, and then 700 people are trying to push every 10 seconds now. So it's like, take a breath. If you push it 10 seconds or 30 seconds, it's not going to make a difference. If there's actual outage issues with GitLab, we will be lenient. The reason it's easy to be lenient too is because, remember, we will not take your work after 5 p.m. What that means is that it's not so much that if you push, like if we have to extend the deadline by a few minutes, that's okay, because pushing after 5 is fine as long as you committed before 5. And you've probably noticed this already, or you've remembered me telling you, the time on GitLab is the time of your commit. Like when I go to the sample exam and I look here, this time here is when I committed it on my local machine. It wasn't when I pushed it, it was when I committed it. So similarly, if you do a commit at 4:58 p.m. and you push it at 5:02 because GitLab was having some issues at 4:59, it will still come up on GitLab as 4:58. So you don't need to worry if you push a few minutes after the deadline if we extend it, like if GitLab's down or something, but you do need to make sure you at least don't commit after the deadline. The worst thing you can do is commit after the deadline, because when we mark your code, we will go back through and we will specifically ignore all commits after 5 p.m. Okay, no matter what. There are no times we accept commits after 5 p.m. It's just we'll either cut off pushing at 5 p.m. or if there's issues with GitLab in the few minutes leading up, we'll extend it by another few minutes and just all calm the F down and, you know, just wait 10 seconds, 30 seconds, push again. Should all be fine. Yeah, so does VLab refer to Tiger VNC or SSH in general? It refers to the connection on to connecting to CSE machines, though. So that's VLab, that's VS Code SSH, that's direct SSH on a terminal. That's those three things. And Gorb says, what API client is installed on VLab? I don't think any is installed on VLab per se, but you can easily install the ARC add-on via Google Chrome, and I believe we've done that somewhere in a lecture. Maybe I dreamt that, because I think Jake did those lectures this term, so I'm not too sure. But it should all just be a Chrome add-on. Like, I can, if tons of people, if it wasn't in a lecture, let me know and I can demonstrate it. So this is a really important topic now. Communication and help during the exam. This is an open book exam, so you are able to use the internet. It is just like literally everything. You can Google stuff. You can look anything up online. You can go through your labs. You can go through your shoots. You can go through the lectures. Use it to its full extent. You know, the one exception is that you're not able to seek help from other students during the exam. So any communication with other students or other people, frankly, after the exam started will result in a 0 for the course. So what that means is that when the exam starts, you can Google stuff, whatever, but you can't message your friends, talk to your friends, talk to other students. You can't talk to ex-students, like all the stuff that would be considered cheating in a normal open book exam. So imagine you're back in high school and you're doing an exam, right, where you have access to the internet and someone's watching you, right? They're not gonna like you emailing your cousin to get answers, right? They're not gonna like you messaging other students on whatever the hell you all chat on these days, TikTok, to get answers. Don't TikTok each other answers for the exam. That would be great. So it's all pretty much, I describe it as like, it's like the internet exists, but everyone else on the planet's dead. That's what the exam is to you. Obviously, if your, you know, mother or father come into the room and they say, would you like me to get you some, make you a smoothie because you seem stressed, you know, you can say, okay, that sounds great. You don't have to be like, you know, you're dead to me, mother, or anything like that weird, or ignore them or anything. It's just like, you can just behave generally normally, use your common sense. Obviously, you can't talk to students, people who've done the course before. Ideally, just no one from, you know, UNSW. It's an exam. Like, don't talk to people. It's relatively straightforward. So, yep. A cheat sheet and Python docs will be included or linked in the repository you're provided. Realistically, that doesn't really matter too much because you can Google stuff anyway. That's kind of a relic from closed book exams. If you have questions or there are things you need clarified during the exam, you can make a private post on our forum, the same ed forum. We make everything automatically private during the exam. Do not message lecturers or tutors on MS Teams. Do not email lecturers or tutors about issues that are not of a sensitive nature. So during the exam, your point of contact with everything basically is going to be via ed. The only time you should be emailing me is realistically if you've had to stop the exam for some, extenuating circumstance. Everything else is on the forum. Don't call me on Teams, don't message me on Teams, don't message your tutors on Teams or call them on Teams. And if you do post on the forum, make sure that you have a detailed description of your issues that include, like making sure your code is most up to date on GitLab is a good place to start. Show screenshots of the issues, explain how you produce the issue, and whether or not you're running it locally or in VLab. The more information, the better. The way I describe this to you again is that what happens is that you're all posting on the forum and replying to other questions we have. And every time you reply, like think of it like a queue. It goes to the end of the queue. So if you ask a really bad question like, hey, my VLab keeps disconnecting, help, we're going to reply after, say, 10 minutes or 5 minutes or however long it takes, and say, can you provide more information? And then if you reply straight away, we're going to be answering the other questions. You know what I mean? So it's like, it's in your interest to try and be specific if you have an issue, because if you're not, you'll actually end up not getting an answer very quickly. So do your best to just, try and do that. Realistically, though, most of the time during the exam, students just have some questions about clarifications, and we tried our best to make exams really clear, because during a good exam, none of you have to post on the forum, right? If during the exam someone finds an issue, we will communicate that to all of you via email. During the exam, we will be emailing you mainly as the form of communication. We won't be posting on the forum. We won't be using like ed notices. We'll be emailing you to your UNSW email address. And that's mainly just for simplicity, because it's all UNSW email. And if there are clarification, we will clarify it in the spec and we will email you that there has been a clarification. Most of the time, remember, these exams are done by multiple tutors. In our case, 3 different tutors will do the entire exam, and we weed out those issues as we go. If you come across issues during the exam that you think are our mistakes, it's always possible, but my advice to students is to not get caught up in that, because I see this sometimes when a student says, oh, can't do this question, doesn't make sense, they must have had an error, blah, blah, blah. And then they post on the forum, and then, they get a response 20 minutes later, and someone says, no, it's fine, and we're certain it's fine, and you've misinterpreted it. And then it's like, now you've lost 20 minutes kind of thing. It's like, not saying you like have to keep working if you're not sure if something works, but it's like, if you feel like there's an actual problem, post about it. If it hasn't been clarified, go work on something else, and you'll come back and you'll either see it's been clarified, small chance, or a bigger chance as we say something like, we believe the question is clear. You obviously can't ask questions about why your code doesn't work. If you say, oh, my code doesn't work, please help, I can't get the right answer, or I can't figure out why I'm getting this compilation error, here's a screenshot of my code, we're not going to help you. It's like a high school exam. We can't just tell you the answer. Imagine you're back, for all the New South Wales students, imagine you're back doing the HSC, and there's these nice elderly men and ladies and whoever else walking around, who are administering your exam, who know nothing about integration by parts. And if you say to them something's wrong, they're going to be like, good luck, child, right? Like, don't. It's the same thing with us. If you're like, my code's not working, I need help, we're going to be like, it's an exam, so save yourself that time. Please be mindful that some students will be sitting the exam later than you. So please be very careful talking about the exam with other students in the hours immediately after the exam. That's just something to be mindful of, because you wouldn't want to share answers because you'd be in some trouble there. In terms of submission for the final exam, there is no submit command like there is for the project. There is simply a push to master. So it's like your labs in the sense that your labs are due at a certain time, funnily enough 5 p.m. And at that time, we take what's on your latest master. So there's no submit command. You just need to make sure that what's on master is what you want. And the only way to check that is you go to GitLab, you look at your GitLab page for the exam, and you look at the last commit and the last time. And if you see it there, you're all good. If you don't see it there, you're not all good. In terms of troubleshooting, if if you're using VLab, here's just some instructions on troubleshooting VLab or VS Code. Obviously, if you're having trouble connecting to CSE systems, that's our responsibility. So, you can always post on the forum about that. We'll do our best to support you there. And then in terms of preparation, the best way to prepare for this is to realistically just go implement parts of the project you didn't implement, or go back and do the tute and lab questions again. We give you a lot of that stuff throughout the term to practice for the final exam. So it's all there, and we have the solutions all released for you. We have provided you with a sample exam here. This sample exam is a Frankenstein of previous exam questions. So this actually gives you a good feel for what the exam will be like. Obviously, we're not saying it'll be exactly like this. Maybe there'll be 8 questions, maybe there'll be 6, and they might be bigger or smaller. Maybe there'll be, bigger and less short answer questions, or more and smaller ones, but the kind of vibe of it's all the same. And when we look at these short answer questions, you can see the nature of them here. Describe and justify 3 attributes of good requirements. Break the following elicited requirements into a list of atomic dot points. Describe the difference between this. Provide a clear and specific example of their usage. Justify your response, and write a user story to capture this. So that's like the short answer stuff. And I think there must be a problem pushing solutions, because I'll sort that out later, because I think we did do some solutions. At least I got them together. I was in a rush trying to get out the door. So I definitely know they got done. They must have just not been pushed to your repo properly. So, yep, that's really it. And then the programming questions, a lot of them will be basically, here is a file with a function. That function does something. Go implement that function, and then make sure you write tests for that function. And then we'll give you marks for the correctness of your implementation. How well your tests work. Basically, can they identify correct and incorrect implementations? And then 25% for your branch coverage. So it's basically implementation coverage and the quality of your tests. Naturally, in this case, we're testing your tests against our implementation. In your final exam, you can expect the same model for all these types of questions. It's just the percentages might be different. There are some questions where we might, weigh the correctness a little bit more, or the branch coverage a little bit more. But in all questions, we will be expecting you to do some kind of implementation and some kind of testing. There was a question earlier about Flask. We do like to ask 1 Flask question per exam. In this case, it's question 12. We mainly ask this again to make sure that students are familiar with Flask. Sometimes we don't ask this. Sometimes we could ask you a question about HTTP and HTTP testing. We could ask you to be given a Flask server and add something to it or change it. We could ask you to write your own Flask server. We could give you a Flask server and ask you to write tests for it. Whatever it is, what I would say is that you should be comfortable with the HTTP landscape. The get, post, push using Flask, sending a request to Flask, etc. Blake says, why did the project need a submit command? That's an excellent question. It didn't. I was just trialing something out. That's about it. I won't get into it, but I'm trialing out the idea of a submit command, because I think it's better when students say this is my work. That's the short answer. They don't have to. It's just it's a bit more appropriate when it's like, this is my work, and it's not like, oh, I accidentally pushed this to master, but I didn't want to do that. It was an accident. This hasn't happened yet in my 3 years of doing this, but I'm just trying this out because it's probably a better approach to actually have students submit. But for the exam, it's just, I don't want to stress people, you don't want to push to master and then connect to CSE and then submit and something else goes wrong. So we just want to keep it really simple. Yeah, that's kind of it. That's the exam. My only advice as well is, if you could please just communicate with me during the exam if something bad happens. I'll always tell people this story because it's freaking hilarious and kind of mind-blowing, but it's like, don't not communicate. The example I gave was, we had a student 153121T1 earlier this year, who the exam finished and they emailed me at midnight and they said, hey, here's a zip of my code. I'm paraphrasing, I'm mixing a few things here. It's like, they said, here's a zip of my code, and they're like, I couldn't push to GitLab, right? And then I was like, what do you mean? And they were like, I had issues with GitLab. So I just, didn't submit my code, and then I asked them, why didn't you push to GitLab? Why didn't you tell me earlier? And they told me that they needed to have a nap after the exam. So they went and they had a nap after the exam because they were very stressed about the exam, and they thought, I will take a 7-hour nap, email Hayden at midnight with a zip of my code and say, here's my code, sorry I couldn't push to GitLab. And it's like, the reason I tell this story, beyond it kind of being just a perplexing idea, right, is like, don't do that for 100 different reasons, but the main one is like, I can only help you so far, Like if you're like, oh my god, I did a commit at 5:00 and 1 second, I'm not an unreasonable person. I'm going to be like, yeah, sure, we'll take it. I don't feel like that 1 second gave you an advantage on anyone. I can explain that to someone higher up, right? Because you got to remember, like everyone that's employed, you have to stand by. Every time I do anything, I have to be comfortable that I could be, someone could come down really hard and be like, this didn't seem right, why'd you do this? And I have to feel comfortable explaining that. So it's like, you're a second late on this, or this happens or that happens and stuff. It's like, we can be lenient if we need to, and we feel like it's fair because I'm comfortable standing behind that. But if you send me a zip of your work 8 hours after the exam's over, it's like, I can't help you there. There's no way I can give you those marks. And then someone turns around later and is like, why'd you do this? That's not fair. And I'm like, I just get my head slapped, right? So it's like, just don't do that, mainly because I just feel terrible not being able to help you. So do your best to communicate. It's just like the product, right? It's like, if there's going to be a student in this course that turns around at the end of week 11 and says, hey, my group did nothing all term and I didn't want to talk about it because I was nervous. And it's like, I appreciate that and I believe you, but that doesn't matter. That's the kind of problem. So when a student submits 8 hours late, I don't know if I believe that one per se, but it's like, there are lots of times students do things and I believe you, but that doesn't matter, right? So it's like, don't be put in that situation. So that's why communication is really important, because if you communicate, it really helps build the case, so to speak. Izzy says, dumb question, but I want to triple check. Is built-in modules the same as built-in libraries? Yes, built-in modules and libraries are all the same as far as I know. There might be some language semantic that people distinguish that with, but as far as I'm concerned, it's all the same. So you can treat them as the same. Okay, that pretty much summarizes everything to do with the exam. I'm going to ask you right now to, in the next couple of minutes, between now and 10:01, ask any questions you have about the exam, just in the next literal minute or two, and I will answer everything that you ask in that time, and we won't answer anything else. We can deal with the forum with that. Then we'll take a break, and then we'll get into our last bonus lecture for the term. And while you're writing those questions, I have to remind you of something, which is that CSE have asked if I could pass on some information about SunSwift, funnily enough, that we talked about it last week, where if you could, so they wanted me to pass this on, so the head of school asked me to pass this on behalf of the team. Said if you're interested in being part of this team, that you should go and apply at sunswift.com/recruitment. The main things to mention are that, it's an opportunity to build, design, race, and deploy systems, particularly software systems in relation to solar electric vehicles. There's a growing software team there that is very interested in creating exciting applications. Big team, all of that exciting stuff. I've talked about this a lot during the term, so I don't think I need to contextualize it too much. I have very little idea about much of this stuff. Don't mistake me talking about the past for me understanding it. So if you have questions, I won't be able to answer them about, what's this, what's that, what's going on, what's the go, how does this affect coursework and this, because I just don't know at all. So, go to that website, sunswift.com/recruitment, and check that out if you're curious more. So I'm just having a look at the questions that have been asked here. Waleed says, any advice on how to prepare for the short answers? Not much practice with the labs, just read slides and sample exam. Yeah, I mean, the short answers, they're always just going to be, here's some knowledge, justify something a lot of the time, or explain something. So yeah, it's really just the tutes. Lectures and tutes are probably the biggest ones for the short answers. If you understand the content, then it's just going to be applying it, really. So, and honestly, a lot of the time in the short answers, it's one of those things where many students will see a short answer question, and regardless of what you're probably going to go look up the lecture slide and read it and go, oh, that's what a user story is, and now it's asking me to write one. I'm going to go and write one. So in a lot of ways, I don't think there's an excessive amount of prep because the questions will be straightforward enough that you'll be able to look up the core content in the course content, and then you'll just have to apply it to some scenario. Justin says, we're trying out some of the NCSS challenges help. I noticed they were reused a lot in the labs. I think they would help for the harder questions. Nick put those together. I think they'd help for the harder questions because I think the NCSS challenges were pretty hard. I would be surprised if we had an exam, there might be one exam question as hard as those, but again, I don't want to speak broadly for all NCSS challenges because some of them were a bit easier and harder than others. Justin says, thoughts on a capture the flag based exam, like finding flags on a backend using HTTP requests. It's an interesting idea. It's probably a little bit difficult in a course like this, given all the stuff we cover. That's super interesting. Vincent says, so our main forms of practice are just tutes and labs. Will there be any revision material released apart from the sample exam? Well, no, not really, because we have 10 weeks of labs and 10 weeks of tutes and a sample exam, and we also gave you some of these questions here. So there's actually quite a lot of material. This is like a common thing that happens, I think, a lot, because I run very practical courses, and it's like students kind of get to the exam period and they say, well, at least they say I seem to, what I see is that there's an expectation that from the start of the exam period to the end, you want to have a bulk of work you haven't seen yet to practice with, and it's more just there's a bulk of work, there's a whole lot of work across the term to practice with. It just happens that you've actually done a lot of it. You're actually prepared for this exam throughout the term already. So don't feel kind of stressed out by feeling oh, there's only a couple things I haven't done. It's well, that's a good thing. That's because you've done a lot. And we give you the material we feel that you need to prepare. And if you feel uneasy about it, you can go back and revise it as well. Lorenzo says, what is an NCSS challenge? They're just some of the harder lab questions. I think were sourced from NCSS challenge because they let you use the questions if you attribute them. So we thought we'd throw those in because we wrote all the questions we had, and then some students said, do you have some more? And we threw those in relatively, kind of quickly, I guess. It was yeah, here's some extra stuff. Yep. Do they have a music player? Do they write the music player built into the card? No. Well, the last time that was done, I believe, the way it was set up was that, this is for the solar car, was that there was a tablet in the car and the tablet's audio output was sent to an amplifier, which was sent to a speaker system. Okay, well, I said it's been 6 minutes and I said let's get your exam questions down. So let's wrap up the exam part of this lecture. Let's take a 5-minute break and then we'll get into a bonus one. None of you have to watch it. I just was we've got some spare time in week 10 and nothing else to talk about. So we're going to be chatting. I don't know why that link isn't working. Oh, that's weird. I'll have to fix that up. Oh, what? Nothing's working. Okay, well, we're going to be chatting about basically prototyping, how to go about, if you have an idea for a software application, how to go about building it relatively quickly. So we'll take a 5-minute break and then get stuck into that right after.